Okay, so let's first of all talk about. Let's see. There we go. Perfect. Talk about our bell work here, real quick. Okay, so first question. What do WinForms, that one's kind of self-explanatory, but what do WinForms, WPF, and UWP stand for? Let's go with UWP first. Somebody raise your hand. What does UWP stand for? Yes, sir.
Windows Presentation Foundation.
UWP, the last one.
Oh, UWP.
Yeah.
Universal Windows Platform.
Universal Windows Platform. Exactly. Very good. All right, somebody else. What does WPF stand for? Yes, sir.
Windows Presentation Foundation.
Excellent. And sir, what does WinForms stand for?
Window Forms.
Yeah, very good. Windows Forms. That's exactly right. Good job. So that being said, what do the similarities and differences appear to be between those three? Alex, what do you think? What does your research suggest?
I know UWP is the new one that's cross-platform.
Yes, yes.
And the other two are the old ones.
Yes, that is correct, yes.
I mean, I think you use, you also, I don't think, have user interface stuff with UWP, like you do with WPF. Isn't that right?
Sort of. Okay, so and as we'll see today, and
But not as much.
okay, so effectively, WinForms is the old way of doing things. We did that calculator already in WinForms, right? And I'll get back to this when we get to that third bullet point here in a second. But WinForms uses the .NET framework, and it's intended to make applications that run on Windows. Full stop. The .NET framework was designed back in I want to say mid 90s, but I know I'm wrong on that. Mid to late-ish 90s, and they built it around Windows. At that time, they weren't thinking about Mac or mobile or anything like that, right? And then WPF is sort of the new WinForms. It's the new visual editor for C# applications. So you can drag and drop buttons and things like that. Where it differs from WinForms is that it uses XML to do the styling. So you know how like in WebDev 1 or WebDev 2, excuse me, we talked about like the grid UI system, right? So like you say, like there's columns and rows and things like that. That's what WPF allows you to do. That way, when you resize the application, everything dynamically resizes with it. Now, Universal Windows Platform means that an application will run the same on all Microsoft platforms. So Windows, Xbox, HoloLens, and so on. Now, obviously, not every single application that, for example, runs on Xbox and Windows also runs on HoloLens. Like, there's not like a virtual reality component to everything, right? But it removes that extra step of having to be like, okay, well, now I want it to be built for HoloLens, so I've got to change a bunch of stuff. No, it's already all there. Now, that brings me to the third bullet point. What do you think are the similarities and differences in the .NET framework and the .NET Core? Anybody want to wager a guess? That one I already kind of talked about a little bit of it, but yes, sir.
Well, the .NET framework is like the predecessor to the core.
Yes.
And it only works on Windows.
Yes, absolutely.
.NET Core works on all platforms.
Correct. So .NET Core, and next time we're going to start a series of videos from Microsoft where the lady that hosts them says this basically verbatim. The .NET Core takes all of the core aspects of the .NET framework and it ports them essentially to a bunch of other platforms. So when I make to give you an example, I don't know for sure if this is exactly how this particular example works, but to give you a kind of constructed example, I can make a game using C# and Unity, right? And then I can build that same game on Xbox, Windows, iOS, Android, Mac, PS4, and so on, right? I can build it for all those platforms. With the .NET framework, that wouldn't be possible because there's not libraries for all those other platforms. But the .NET Core allows me to easily port, and it doesn't just apply to Unity. I mean, Visual Studio is the same way. It allows me to port my application easily and virtually seamlessly to all other existing platforms. Okay. To paraphrase what the lady in the video series from Microsoft says, .NET Framework will be effectively supported forever because they can't just drop support for it since there's a ton of things that were built on it. But the .NET Core is the future. So if you're going to start a project in Visual Studio, use the .NET Core. Okay, you just do it. Even if you're like, oh, this is going to be even if you're like how the Nanosaur developers, Pangea Software, this like the way they are for Nanosaur on Mac, they're like, this is Mac only. It will only ever be Mac. It will never be on Windows. That kind of stuff. Even if that's how you're feeling about your Windows application, I will never put it on any other platform. Go ahead and choose .NET Core in case you change your mind down the road, right? Might not hurt. Additionally, while I'm thinking of it, it might be worth pointing out that future versions of Windows might not be as supportive of the .NET Core or .NET Framework. Does that make sense? Like, it'll still be supported, but there might be features you need that aren't in the framework, right? As they introduce new features, they're not going to add them to the .NET Framework. They're just going to add them to the .NET Core. Does that make sense? So you might even run into a Windows compatibility issue if you don't do that. Okay, so here in just a bit, I will have that up on Canvas for you to submit your bell work. So just, like I said, just a sentence or two on each of those is absolutely fine. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to watch a video from our friend Mr. Tim Corey. Now, this is a lengthy video. It's about an hour, a little over an hour. Go ahead and boot up Visual Studio if you would. And what this video is the basics and best practices of WPF, Windows Presentation Foundation. And like I said, that allows us to scale the size of application. There's other things too, but it allows us to scale the size of an application to scale dynamically so that all the buttons and so on are the appropriate size. Now, this concept becomes really important next in the next phase of this of C# programming, C# 2, when we start talking about ASP.NET, okay, which is effectively Microsoft's version of PHP, okay. It uses a lot of the WPF concepts, the XML concepts and things like that. I mean, it doesn't have to, but a lot of times it does, in conjunction with CSS and JavaScript and HTML and things like that, to build dynamic websites. So this is a good introduction to how to do WPF stuff, okay? So thus far this semester, we talked about text-based C# applications. We've done some stuff with Unity, so we could kind of dip our toes in the water, if you will, of how to do visual things with C#, even though Unity was doing a lot of the heavy lifting for us. And then the remainder of this semester is going to be about doing basic visual things in WPF and in C#. So today we'll watch this video, and this is a super, super broad overview of WPF and what it's used for. We're not going to like make a cool application really. It's just kind of like, here's how you do it, here's how columns work and that kind of stuff. Since you've already had we talked about CSS Grid and things like that already in WebDev 2 and a little bit in WebDev 1. You should be already familiar with a lot of the things he's going to discuss. Okay. Quick sidebar question. Raise your hand if you know the answer. Does anybody know what XML stands for? XML, does anybody have any idea?
Extensible markup language.
Yeah, good job. Extensible markup language. Very good. So it's a markup language just like HTML is, which is hypertext markup language, right? Yeah, I'm sorry. I was like, wait a second, I think I got a letter wrong. But anyway, starting next time, we'll start watching a series of videos from Microsoft, which will go into more detail about various aspects of WPF and that sort of thing. So we're going to kind of fire hose you with information today. Don't worry, though. Just follow along and you'll be fine. I'm not going to pause the video like I do sometimes just because you'll have plenty of time to do the very minor thing I'm going to ask you to do. So it's not a big deal if you get a little lost. Just try to keep up the best you can. And then, like I said, next time we'll start watching videos that will go into detail as opposed to just being a broad overview. That way, hopefully, by the end of the semester, you will have a pretty good idea of how to do basic visual things with C#. Okay, so without further ado, let's hop over here and let's watch this video by Mr. Tim Corey.
Hello again, this is Tim Corey, and in this video, I'm going to introduce you to WPF. But before I do, I just want to mention a couple of housekeeping things. First, if you haven't already subscribed to my email list, you might want to pause. Alright, so enough housekeeping, let's dive into WPF. Here I have Visual Studio 2017. Now, if you're using 2015 or earlier, it's probably about the same, but just know that I'm the latest version here, and the latest version is free. So if you go to visualstudio.com, you can find the community edition for free there. So go ahead and get that if you're able. Now, here what I'm going to do is we're going to start a new project by going to New Project right down here. Now you could just look for WPF here, or you could search for it here on the left. But the tricky thing here that you want to make sure you avoid is getting the wrong version of WPF. Note the 7 or 8 different options we have here. We don't want most of these options. In fact, we only want one. And the one you want is actually the top one, the WPF app.NET framework. And it's in Visual C#. There's also...
Sorry, real quick. I know that I just went on a rant about using the .NET Core. In both my and his defense, .NET Core was obviously much newer in 2017 when this video was made. As you can see on the left-hand side there, .NET Core is an option. .NET Core has been out since like 2014 or 15, I think. 2015 is when .NET Core was officially introduced, I think. So anyway, you can do either one. My recommendation would be for this particular exercise to use .NET Framework. That way that you can follow him exactly. But just be aware that yes, always use .NET Core unless you're watching a video from a couple of years ago, in which case they're probably going to use .NET Framework. So just wanted to make that clear, just so you're not like, hey, but you just said. So just wanted to let you know.
Also one here, note it's for Visual Basic. That's not what we want. You can also go to Windows Classic over here on the left, Templates, Visual C#, select Windows Classic, and you'll find WPF app. So we're going to select this WPF app.NET framework. Let's name this WPF demo. Now I'm going to give my project name and my solution name the same name just because it's easiest. That's the simplest way for one project, one solution. But I would recommend that if you're going to create a quote unquote real application or going to move forward with this in a more professional manner, what I typically do is say something like WPF UI, or all caps WPF UI. Looks a little funny, but it's an acronym. There's 2 acronyms actually. And then I'd call this the demo project or something like that. Just so you have a solution name that's separate from your user interface, because your user interface could change, and also it doesn't represent your entire solution if it's named after just your user interface. Because you really should have a class library, and you should have some other stuff possibly. And so the project name and solution name usually should be different. But in this case, I'm going to say WPF demo, and the same for the solution. And we'll hit OK here and create a project. Now, while it's doing that, let's talk about what the difference is between WPF and WinForms, because this is really kind of the same ballpark that the two operate in. They're kind of the same-ish, but they're not the same. Now, if you've seen my other videos, you've probably seen a lot of WinForms. WinForms is what came first, and it's also the easiest to use. Now, why create WPF? Well, Microsoft wanted to have a form application that could be more modern in feel. And WinForms is just kind of limited by some of the old school stuff that's kind of still dragging along with it. And they've tried to make it a little more modern. They try to clean it up. They've done a great job. But the reality is it's still old school. And one of the ways that's really evident is whenever you get into anything graphical with WinForms. WinForms still uses GDI, which is a way of rendering things that pulls right from the CPU, the processor. And so it really puts a burden on the processor and slows things down. Now that used to be how he did everything back in the 90s.
Sorry, hey, I know I said I wasn't going to pause, but now I'm going to pause. Before we move on, do you already kind of sort of see how this little area down here, I don't know how well you can see that, but this little area down here kind of looks like a website, right? We have the little angle brackets that are, we have window here, and then we have title equals main window, height, width, right? And that kind of thing. So I'm hoping here in a minute, whenever he really starts doing stuff, you're going to be like, oh, I see. That looks exactly more or less like the thing we're already doing. One other side note, I mentioned that we're going to do ASP.NET stuff in C# 2. So this won't be relevant until then. But just as a heads up, sometimes people get confused when they're doing an ASP.NET application because it's going to have C# code that's like pulling the data and different things like that, but it also may have JavaScript, and it also may have HTML and CSS and stuff, which all kind of look the same. So just be aware, try to like, and we'll talk about this more next semester, try to break up your code as much as possible, and with comments and that sort of thing, so you can tell what part of the code is like, say for example, JavaScript, and what part is C# and that kind of stuff. So, all right, let's move on.
But then we got video cards, and video cards were dedicated to rendering and displaying video and other graphical elements. And so WPF says, well, we don't want to base our stuff on GDI. We want to use DirectX and actually talk to the video card, which means that if you want to, you can create a 3D form that it's a cube and it spins in air and every side has a different video playing on it. And it will work. You might need a bigger video card, but it will work. And that's definitely something you could not do in WinForms. Now, that's not exactly a normal line of business application, but there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with that. Now, we're not going to get in depth into all that really deep stuff, but I wanted to at least give you an overview of how to get started in WPF and really understand the basics of what's going on here. The other thing that WPF does differently is data binding. And data binding is really big in WPF. You can data bind to anything. And that's not really true in WinForms, not as much. And so there's a lot of power there, but it also adds a layer of complexity. And so we're going to kind of touch on that a little bit. And finally, WPF it's a little bit more like HTML and CSS in the idea that you can apply a style at the project level or at the form level or the item level. And so we'll see some of those properties we're going to add that we're kind of familiar with, but are a little bit different, a little bit tweaked. So those are the kind of things that make WPF a little different. Like I said, it's a little bit bigger of a barrier to entry than WinForms is. WinForms is a drag and drop and just get started. And you can really start in WinForms in day one. Whereas WPF is a little bit more time consuming to get started. And so I want to kind of reduce that barrier of entry a little bit and kind of just give you an overview of how WPF works. So we've got our form here that we've created. This is the starter form. It's essentially form 1 if you're familiar with the WinForms, but this is actually called main window. So this is form 1, and right at the bat, if you look just up here at this window, it looks pretty much the same as what we're used to. In fact, if we run this, let me start this real quick, it's going to look almost identical to a WinForm application. And actually start over here. So this is it. This is the blank form. It looks a little different, but it kind of works the same. It has our 3 buttons up here: minimize, maximize, and close. This is extra, and this is actually a WPF debugging thing. And so I'll show you how to turn that off in a minute. But this allows us to do some debugging around WPF. But this is not actually part of our form. And if we were to run this out,
it's very similar to the inspector tools like in Chrome. Like as an example, as you could probably guess, those little pointers and stuff will allow you to do things like click on a button, for example, and like show me the code attached to that button as the program is running, that kind of stuff. That way you can do that sort of things.
outside of Visual Studio, we would not get this black box. And you can move it around if you want. Right, like that. So let's close this out now, and let's look at what our form is made up of. Now, in WinForms, the code behind is empty, which it is here as well. If we right-click on this and say View Code, it looks identical to WinForms. We have just the constructor, and it has the initialized components. It's a partial class. That's all there really is to it. But if you look, we have this extra thing down here. And this is where people get a little bit lost or a little bit confused or even scared. This is XAML or XAML. And what XAML is the design system for building this form. And it's XML essentially, but it's the extensible application markup language instead of just extensible markup language. So this is what Microsoft created in order to help us build these forms. And so everything you put on this form is going to have XAML down here to correspond to that element. So for example, I'm going to show you how to drag and drop and put a button on the form. Now, before we go any further, I want you to pause for a minute and listen to what I'm saying right now, because this is important. Don't do that. Don't drag and drop onto a WPF form. That's not how they're designed. Okay? I'll show you how to do it safely, but the reality is you should probably avoid it almost entirely. And that's the first place where people get tripped up, is they treat it like a WinForm application, come to their toolbox, and just start dragging things on. That really reduces the power of WPF, and essentially it makes it so that you really should just use WinForms. Because if you're going to take away all the power of WPF, there's no point to it, and it's just added complexity for no real reason. So don't drag and drop. But I did. Okay? And the reason I did is I want to show you what this does. Notice down here in our XAML, we now have this line of text. Let's actually unpin it so you can actually see the whole line of text. So you have button, and then it says x:\name equals button. Content equals button. That's the actual text inside the button. This is the name of the button. Horizontal alignment is left. Here's the margin. So it's aligned to the left. It's got a margin of this. It's got a vertical alignment to top and the width of 75. The reason why drag and drop onto our window here is bad is because of all of this stuff right here. And what is that? Well, it's hard-coded locations. Now again, WinForms, we're used to this. We have to have this. There's no way of doing this other than having hard-coded locations. But in WPF, it's different. And so we're going to treat it differently. But I wanted to show you at least the fact that the XAML changes. So I'm going to take this away, and we're going to start over. Now the very first thing you need to know about XAML is the grid system. And so that's typically what you have on the form is a grid. And a grid can have multiple elements inside of it. And that's important because certain items can have only one element inside them. Other elements can have multiple items inside them. The grid can have multiple. Now think of the grid a little bit like an Excel spreadsheet, except that right now we only have one cell, and that's this entire window. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually put some grids on here, so we can actually have different places to put things. Where I do that is by inside grid, and it's important thing to note here, if you're not familiar with open and closing tags, this is an open tag, this is a close tag. Okay, the bottom one down, it's kind of highlighting both of them. The bottom one down here is a close tag because it has a slash in front of grid. So this is an open tag, and we have to do things outside of these brackets to be inside the grid. So between this bracket right here and this bracket. So open tag, close tag, inside here, we need to create new items or new elements. So we open up our, essentially what is a less than sign, and we say grid dot column definitions. Notice we have IntelliSense, which is nice. IntelliSense is not perfect in XAML. It's a little ugly in some spots, but it gets the job done. Notice when I closed out my, essentially my greater than sign here, when I closed that out, it gave me the close tag. This is an open tag, now a close tag. Inside here, this is the column definitions. So how many columns do I have going down here on my grid? So the first column I'm going to say column definition, and I have to give it a width. So the first one I'm going to give, here's what I do. I give my first and last column a 20 pixel width. And the reason why is it creates this nice little border around my form where we don't put things right up to the edge of the form. There's a little bit of white space on the edge of our form. So that's how I do things. You don't have to do it the same way, but that's just kind of my standard. Now this is what's called a self-closing, in that we put a slash at the end, and now this is both the open and the close. So it only has the stuff in here to apply any kind of modification to a column definition. So this is now defined one column. I'm going to do this a few more times. I'm going to copy this and paste it. But instead of the width of 20, now 20 represents pixels. We don't say 20px like you would in HTML or CSS. Instead, we just say 20. But in WPF, we don't typically specify hard and fast widths or heights. We try to avoid those kind of things as much as possible. And the reason why is because a WPF form can be flexible. It can grow to fill the space it needs. It can shrink to fit the space that it has available to it. And that's one of the real big improvements that everyday applications get to use. It used to be, I'm going to date myself here a little bit, but it used to be we had monitors that had a screen ratio of 800 pixels by 600 pixels. You know, something small like that. And then we had these big complicated forms. Well, the problem was our form might have been designed for a 1024 by 768 screen. What happens when you get it on a 800 by 600 screen? Well, in WinForms, it means you can't see the right-hand side or the bottom of the form. That's really a problem because usually in the bottom of the form is where the submit button is. And it didn't even put a nice scroll bar so you could scroll. It was just off a screen. And that was a real problem. We actually had to design our applications knowing what the smallest screen resolution was going to be and then not making the form any bigger than that. And that's really ugly. Now, we shouldn't have that today, but there are other issues that come along with screen sizes. For example, you might have a small form, and if you maximize that thing, in WinForms, all the stuff's in the upper left-hand corner, and you have just gray space on the rest of the screen. That's not very pleasant to look at. In WPF, we can have a more responsive design where the form kind of fills the screen however big the screen is or however small the screen is. We can also do things like show more stuff if there's more real estate available to us. And so WPF's a lot of flexibility there, but you can't lock it down to set widths and heights. And so as much as possible, we avoid set pixels. So I want you to think, whenever you see a pixel number, so for example 20, whenever you see that in WPF, I want you to pause and say, is this right? And assume that it's not. Now, in this case, it is correct. I want to have that set border no matter how big or how small the window gets. That does mean that the window gets to be 40 pixels high by 40 pixels wide, we'd see nothing but border. And you know what? At that point, yeah, you probably should, because it's a stupid small window. There's not really a point to it. So that's what I specify for my border, but I don't want my border here. I want to have a normal column. And so what I specify is auto. And what auto allows me to do is WPF says we're going to handle the width of this column based upon whatever you put in it. And so you put something really wide in it, the column's going to be wide. If you put something kind of small in there, the column's going to be small. Think of it kind of like an HTML table, if you're familiar with those. So the table would get bigger or smaller depending on what goes inside them. So that's what we're going to have for our normal columns. I'm going to copy this and paste it a couple more times. Now let's actually make this a little smaller. Now I'm going to paste it one more time, but I'm going to change this. Instead of auto, I'm going to put star. Now what star says is that it's going to take up the rest of the available width. Notice up here we have this one star now. And so we've got a width here of 20, so that's this column right here. We have 3 autos. They're not really showing. That's because they're all in this line, because there's nothing in the column, therefore their width is 0. And then we have a star that takes up the rest of the space, and I put that on the right hand side. So this goes far left to far right. Now the reason I did this is because otherwise, if I didn't have a star column, these auto columns would all take up the same amount of space and kind of fill in the gaps here. And that's not really what I want. I want to have one column fill in the rest. So I have this one column here that takes up the rest of the space on my form, and so it will grow or shrink depending on what the other columns do. That's perfect. And I'm going to take this, copy this first one, and put it at the end. Now I have my column at the end, again with that 20 pixels of white space. And that's all there is to defining columns. You have your grid.column definition. Inside there you define the number of columns you want and what the sizes are going to be. Now, just so you know, you can have multiple star columns. If you do, each column will take, if you have 2, each column will take half of the leftover space. If you have 3, each will take a third. And so it's just kind of divvies up whatever's left over the number of star columns available. And I just use 1 usually. Also note that the number of columns I put here is, at this point, kind of just by feel. I think I'll probably need 3 columns at least. So I just put 3 here, but you know what? If I need more, I just copy and paste and put more in. Now, we'll see how to reference these in a little bit, but for right now, I just want to let you know that we reference these columns on a 0-based counting array. So this is column 0, column 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So 0 through 5. There's a total of 6 columns. So that's our columns. Now, if you are thinking ahead, you'll probably think, okay, that means if we have columns, we probably have rows. And you are correct. And you can probably guess how we define rows. Grid.row definitions. Inside here, we say row definition. And instead of height, instead of width, because it's not a column, it's a row, and rows get height. So again, what we're going to do is say 20. Now note you cannot hit the double quote here. It just adds one. In C#, it would kind of skip over that since you hit double quote and it knows it's there, but you can't in XAML. It's one of those shortcuts that I wish they had in XAML. They just haven't gotten around to yet. And again, this is a self-closing row. So close it out. And we'll do the same thing here. We're going to copy and paste this. We're going to change this to be auto. Same deal here. Auto works the same way. It's just in rows instead of columns. And usually I add a few more rows than I do columns just because we have more stuff going on. And then the last one, or the second to last one I hit is a star. And then one last one I set again to our 20. So now we have our first and our last row.
Before we go any further, can you already kind of see what the big major advantage of this is? Right? That by using auto and by using the star and that sort of thing, we are telling it to scale relatively, right? And so, I mean, the biggest reason that WPF exists in the first place is the reason he gave a moment ago. That if the standard monitor size was 800 by 600, which it was at one time, that was the case whenever I was in high school and below. But also at that time, people were starting to come out with widescreen monitors like the ones that you all have. Well, if I design it for that and then someone loads it up on an 800 by 600 screen, like he said, it's going to be pulled off of the sides. So anyway, yeah, if you've been working with tables, which all of you have, this should be pretty basic to you. And if you've been working with CSS Grid and that sort of thing.
Row are 20 pixels high. We have 5 rows that are auto height, and then one that is that star height. So we have our columns and we have our rows. So that's great. Now to this point, you're probably thinking, man, we're not using our screen real estate very good. Let's see if we can change that up. And we can. We have these buttons over here. Let's zoom in here. So these buttons right here, one has a horizontal line. That's what we're currently highlighting. And what that indicates is this configuration right here, where we have our XAML on the bottom and our design on the top, or vice versa. In fact, we can switch that using this swap button here. So we could switch that around and totally mess you up, but we'll keep it the way it is. So that's this line, this horizontal line over here represents this relationship right here, whereas the vertical line right here represents a vertical split, and that looks like this. And that's usually a little bit easier because usually we have a widescreen monitor and so we have a little more space. Now what I typically do is I'll try and move my window around and then shrink down one side. You can do that. So we can actually still see our whole window, but have a little more real estate on the right to work in our XAML. It's not a perfect world, but it's a little closer. And if you are not dealing with the increased font size that I have on mine for video, you'll probably be able to see a little more on your screen than I do on mine. So this gives us a little better view of XAML. Oh, don't forget as well, those down here. Those are our icons. So again, you can switch back to our horizontal split. We can also collapse one of the panes and just see either the XAML or the actual window. So there's a lot you can do with it. The one thing that I have not found how to do, and I'd love for someone to find out how to do this, or for someone to actually get this pushed through as a change, is I'd love to be able to separate my XAML from my UI. And so I could pull this, say it's 2 tabs now instead of having just one pane split in half. That way I could take this side over here and put it on a different monitor. But you can't do that. That's kind of a bummer. But I'd love to be able to do that so I have my actual live output view in one monitor and my XAML on a different monitor. But that's not something that WPF is set up for yet. That'd probably be, Tim's wish list number 1 for WPF. A close number 2 is that being able to hit the double quote and just skipping over instead of adding an extra one. Okay, so we've gone through, we've added our columns and our rows, which seems kind of boring. And in fact, if we run this, it would look no different because these columns and rows are invisible. They don't actually show anything. So let's actually add something here to make it a little more useful. All right, so let's start with a very simple label, or in this case, it's called a text block. Now, if you're not sure what you're looking for, here's what you can do. Go to your toolbox and look for the different items. In fact, here's text block, here's text box, which, that's great. Block and box. We can't get those two mixed up, right? But block is the one that's a label, essentially. Now, there's a separate one for label, but typically we just use text block. Essentially what it is just text on the screen. I think label is a little more associated with a text box, but it all comes down to just displaying text. And so I end up using just text block usually. So if you weren't sure what to put in here, you could look over here and get the name and just type it out, or you could even drag and drop it either on the XAML or the form and then modify it. But just make sure you take off all of those, left align and top.
So I was waiting to this point in the video to mention this. So remember how he said don't drag and drop? He didn't mean don't drag and drop. He meant don't drag and drop and then just walk away, right? Like drag and drop, all right, we're good, everything's fine. No, you can definitely drag and drop. And in fact, I would encourage you to do so. Don't try to write this all by hand, for goodness sakes. Like there are some people that look at people that use Dreamweaver, for example, which has drag and drop features for HTML like that, and they're like, oh, that person, they don't know anything. It's like, why? Because they don't have every piece of code memorized. No, it's okay to use some sort of IDE like that, right? That's totally fine. But just like he said, make sure that you remove any of the, here's where it is, here's how big it is, that kind of stuff, and you're going to add that, you're going to customize and add that all in later, or in the case of the grid, you've already done that.
Up and left and all the stuff that locks it down to a certain spot. All right, so, but I'd recommend if you can learn it, that'd be great, or look over here and just start typing that. Now note that since I clicked off of my XAML, it tried to render it over here and it said, oh, nope, that's invalid markup. And with invalid markup, it breaks things. Let's see if you could take that away. Back comes the window, that's great. So if you have invalid markup, then it's going to yell at you until you get it right. And there is some IntelliSense down here saying, okay, here's the problem. Our error reporting are little squigglies. But just know that you have to have valid XAML in order for the form to show, which again, it's a little more difficult than WinForms because you can get it wrong. But at the end of the day, it usually comes down to just close out your item. There I close out my text block with a slash at the end and life is good again. So you can do that if you want. But for right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let's get a text block. I'm going to say, I want it to be grid.column. And remember I said before that our columns and rows are zero-based counting. So if I want to specify that it goes in a certain column and a certain row, I have to start at 0. The cool thing though is, since I use this 20 here, which is essentially a buffer column and a buffer row, I can actually go down one below, and that's column 1. So my thought process, or my best practice for myself, is I say I never put anything in column 0 or row 0. It always starts in column 1. And so in this case, column 1 and row 1. So the column is 1 and the grid dot row is 1 as well. I'm going to close out the tag, and then inside between the closing and the opening, I'm just going to put text. Let's say hello world. And check it out. We have hello world right up here. Now the first thing you might notice is that it's kind of small. It's, how do we specify the height of this font? Well, we didn't. And so it took the overall default. But we can change that. Now I could say, right inside next to grid.row, before the close of the opening text block, I could say font size equals, let's go with 18. And now it's bigger. All right, in fact, I can change it again. I can say 28. And it's bigger again. Notice this row has gotten larger because the label inside it is larger. Now, what if I didn't know the font size that I wanted? Well, if you're selecting text block, you can open up properties. Now remember, properties, just like in WinForms, properties allows us to modify the properties of whatever element we're selecting. In this case, text block. So we could say the text is hello world. We could change that if you wanted to. In fact, we could say hi world. And we click off this, notice that if we scroll over here, now it says text equals hi world. Now, why it changed this? Well, I had it between the opening and closing tag of text block. But the properties window says, not really. That's not where it should go. It instead should go in the text property of the text block, and it should be a self-closing tag. The text block is. So it changed a little bit, and also changed the value here to hi world. Notice over here, Window's a little smaller here, but it says hi world. Now, note these draggable arrow things here. Don't drag them. If you were to drag these, it would resize the column and say that's the width the column has to be. We don't want to change that. We want this to be nothing but auto-adjusted columns and rows. So if you want to see this grid go away, what you can do is click outside this grid tag, but inside the window tag. So right here, the grid goes away. You can see what your form kind of looks like in the real world. Now, let's go back to properties here on the text block. We'll click on there. And we can change things like the text is, I'm not even sure I want to pronounce that, CGO, Sego, I'm not sure. But that's the default font, and now we specify the pixel of 28 pixels. That's right there. Notice if we were to change this to something else, let's go to 36. If we were to click off this, watch this right here, it changed the font size to 36, and it gets a little bigger over here. So this property window right here is the same as modifying it directly in XAML. The only difference is, like with our text, where we did it inside between the open and closing tags, if it likes something different, it's going to change it when you make the change. Also note the color here next to the 36, it's white. Let's see if you can zoom in there. It's white, and that means it's a local change versus this right here is inherited from system.resource. So WPF has a hierarchy of application of styles, just like CSS does on the web. And so you first have this global style in the system resource, and then you can apply themes which can be global or for a certain set of forms. And then you can go down and apply at the form level and finally at the local level. And so depending on where it applies, this icon color will change, letting you know that. All right, so and these right here aren't set at all. They're the default. So that's all well and good. Let's actually shrink down the property window so you can see our form again. But there's a couple things I want to show you. First of all, you don't want to specify a font size for every single item on your form. So let's do this. Up here in Window, notice that Window has a whole bunch of stuff we kind of ignored up until now. And most of the stuff you really don't want to change. This is kind of stuff that's bringing it, saying, okay, here's what this should do as far as look and all the rest. And unless you know what you're doing, leave it alone. But there's a couple things we can change. First is the title bar, main window. That's what's up right here. We can change this to our WPF demo, and we'll notice it changes over here in our preview window. Now the height and width are set at 350 and 525. And hopefully you remember my warning and are saying, wait a minute, we've got hard-coded height and width. And that's a problem, right? Yes and no. It's probably not the right height and width you want for your form when you first start up. You might want something different, but just know this is the starting height and width. You can change it to whatever height and width you want going forward once the application is running. You can change it to be 525 by 525, a square. You can change it to be full screen, 1920 by 1080. It's whatever you want it to be at runtime, but the starting height and width are these right here. And so we can change it. In fact, if we were to change this to be 525, notice my form got taller. I'll actually back out of that. So this is something to address, at least think about, should I change the height and width of my form? But there's more we can do here. There's more properties we can actually access. In fact, if we go to properties, you'll see a whole bunch here. But we can say font size equals, let's make it 18. Now what is this? This is now the default font size for this form. Note that it did not change Hi World. And the reason why is because Hi World already has a font size. Therefore, we're not going to override it in order to use our form's global font size. But anything new or anything that does not have a font size specified gets a font size of 18 now. You can also set things like font family. Now, this right here is not IntelliSense backed. And that's probably Tim's wish list number 3, would be to have an IntelliSense list for font family. This is one of those times where I would drop into the properties and go to our font family here and change this to, change this right here. And so you want something different, if you want something a little more fun, you can do that. But typically, say sketch flow print, and there you go. Yeah, it's kind of fun. But typically, this Sigio UI is what we use, or the light version of that as well. I kind of like the light version. It's a little more crisp and clean, I think. But I changed that here instead of changing that right in line, because I can never remember how to spell this. And since there's no IntelliSense, that's a problem for me. And I also rearrange where it's going to be just so I can see it without having to scroll it all to see it. So there's my font size, there's my font family. Notice the font family changed this font's family. That's because I had not specified a font family down here for my text block. So it didn't change the size, but it did change the family. Now if I took out size, let's Control X that, notice that it's it's not big, but it's not as small as it was. And that's because our font size by default is 18. Now for this one, we're gonna make it a little bigger. All right, so let's also add a line break here. In XAML, line breaks don't really matter. So you can add line breaks as you feel necessary in order to make it readable for you. In this case, I don't want to scroll off the right of the screen. I want to see all my properties right in line. Now let's change this hi world to be WPF Super Demo. Now note what that did. That made our column 268 pixels wide, which that's going to be a problem going forward, but that's okay. We're going to deal with that in a minute. But I want to kind of demonstrate the width of this column. Also notice this first row is 48 pixels high because that's what this label needs. Why does it need that much? Because of the font size and how much text is in it. It has nothing to do with setting the width and the height of the label. All right, so now let's add a text box and a text block, both. We're gonna have as, let's say it's first name and then a text box to have us actually type in our first name. So let's start with a text block first. We're gonna put that underneath our label. Right here, we're gonna put first name. Then we're gonna have a text box that says, or allows us to type in our first name. So right down here below our text box, below our text block, but on the same level, we're not going to nest it inside. Notice we're not putting anything inside of our column definitions. That's not where this stuff goes. We define our columns up here, we define our rows up here, down here, just kind of wherever we feel like inside here, we put our other values, our other items. And so what I like to do is
Yes, sir. Go right ahead.
How in the world do you get the little properties window back if you close it?
Right over here.
The one that's below the Solution Explorer? Like when you type in the text box, the properties for the text box?
Oh.
Not the main properties.
Oh. Click the word text block.
Oh.
Like over in your code editor, and then when you click on the properties thing to expand it, it will be the properties for that element. At least it should. Okay, right here where it says text block,
Yeah, I clicked in there.
if you click there and then click your properties window right over here, properties tab, excuse me.
See, I don't have my tabs over there. When I go to view and view the tabs, I only have the ones on the left side.
Okay, I believe that's under view,
I've been looking over there.
or okay. Let's finish this up and we'll circle back around to that and get that figured out. Sorry about that. I'm not sure why that's the case.
I like to keep some sort of order going on here where, column 1, row 1 stuff goes here. Column 2, row 1 goes right below it. Kind of going this way up top, then down the next row and this way, then down the next row and this way. That's kind of how I do it, but it's really up to you how you decide you want to do it. In this case, we're going to do text block. We're going to say grid.column, still column 1. And we're going to say grid.row is 2, right below it. We're going to leave off the font size. We will say font weight equals, let's just say bold. And then I'll say text equals, and our text is going to be first name. I will do the closeout with a slash, and there's our first name. Notice the font weight didn't really change anything here, and that's because we're using the thin font. And so what we're going to do is actually change the font family to this Seggio UI. So I'll do that right here. like so. Notice it's now very, very bold. So let's change this to be not bold. And it's a little better. You do have some options here. Font weight. There's other things like black, and there's semi-bold and semi-heavy, light and regular and all the rest. You can try out some work, some don't, depending on the font. Some fonts have the ability to do these things, some fonts do not. So you kind of just play around depending on what you want to do. So there's our text box. I'm sorry, text block. I told you that's been confusing. There's a text block that says first name. So let's now create a text box. Groupie CIS, I'll put it right below. Text box. And this we need to give it a name. So x:name. Why x:name? Well, that's just how XAML does it. So this name is the actual name for our text box. So we'll call this first name text. Now, again, if you come from a WinForm application background, you might have already realized we didn't name this here, we didn't name this. So how do you reference those in code? Well, we don't really. They don't have names. And we could give them names if we wanted to reference them, but we don't have to give them names. And behind the scenes, it probably gives them a name, and I don't really care. All we really care about is what we need to do. In this case, we don't need to give it a name if we don't need to reference it. And so that kind of cuts down the amount of XAML we have to type. So if you don't need to name it, don't. So in this case, we have a text box, first name text, because we assume we're going to access this text box later. And then we could specify other stuff, but for now, let's just close this out. And actually put the closing tag like that. We can change it. There we go. And so now we should have a text box. And where's the text box? It's up there because we didn't give it all this other stuff. So let's do that. Grid.column, column 2. Grid.row, row 2. Now it's right there. And if we put our cursor here, we notice that that's our text box. Not very big, right? Well, in this case, we have to give it some sort of width or minimum width, or otherwise give it a size. So width equals, and again, this is pixels. We can say 300, make it really big. We can say 30 to make it kind of small. And you kind of experiment with what looks good to you. Probably something more like 150 is passable. And this is where our forms start to take shape, but it's a little ugly. In fact, if we move this over here, we notice we had a label up here, first name, and way over here we have our actual text box. We should also get rid of this as well. I don't really find a use for these things here, so let's get rid of them. I can minimize them for now, but we're actually going to get rid of them entirely in just a minute. But first I want to address this issue of this space right here. We didn't specify that space should be there. So why is it there? Well, the reason it's there is because notice how it ends, or it starts right after, in line after this right here. So this is column 1. And column 1 is the width of the largest item. In this case, our header label, the WPF Super Demo. So since it's that width, the next item that gets put in this column, it's not going to fill that column if it doesn't need to. And in fact, we haven't said make the font size huge and expand to fill the column. Instead, we said here's the font size, here's the font, and here's the actual text. And therefore, it only takes up this much of the column. And this much is then blank. Now, it's not really what we want. We don't want this big label affecting all the rest of the items in the column. How do you fix that? Real simple. We come to our text block, the one that is affecting everything else. And inside of it, we say grid dot column span. Now, what column span does is it says, I want this item to go in more than one column. In fact, I want it to go in 2, 3, 4, however many you want. In this case, we have 1, 2, 3 columns before the star column. Let's specify 3. Now notice what happens on our form. Now our text box has shot right over and it's tucked up almost next to first name. Perfect. So now our header label spans multiple columns, which means that it's no longer the largest thing in the column. First name is. That's why this is tucked up right next to it. Now you also might notice that these two are really close together, and so is this to an extent. And so we can also look to address that spacing by adding margins and padding. So let's do this. Let's go down here and say margin equals. Now the margin here allows us to add multiple dimensions. We can add 1. So say let's add 20. And then what it's done is put 20 on every side, 20 pixels. Therefore, it's pushed this down, it's pushed this over, it's not really done anything over here because there's nothing to bump up against, but if it did, it put a space there, and it's also pushed it down 20 pixels from the above row. So this row is essentially 40 pixels larger, and the column is 40 pixels larger. Now we're spanning 3 columns, so it's not a big deal. But for the row itself, the row is pretty high. So that's if you want to specify all 4 dimensions, left, top, right, and bottom, all at once. Or you can say, comma, 0. Now notice we've got 20 on the left, 20 on the right, none up top, and none down below. What this indicates is this is the left and right, this is the top and bottom. But maybe that's not what you want either. Maybe you want to specify a different width of margin for each dimension. In which case you could say comma 0, comma 0. Now notice we have 20 pixels to the left, none up top, none to the right, none down below. Now, in our case, we don't want the padding to be on the left, we want it to be below our label. Which one's below? Well, it goes in a clockwise pattern starting from the left. It goes left, top, right, bottom. Therefore, we can say left, top, right, bottom. Bottom is the last one. Therefore, the last one gets, let's just do 10. Notice now that first name and the text box have both bumped down because we have a 10 pixel margin between our header label and this row. Now those of you following along will probably think, now wait a minute, you didn't have to do this column definition of 20 on both the left and the right and the top and the bottom as well, because you could have just done it with margins. And yeah, kind of. The problem with that is that it's a little hard to manipulate when you're talking about a form that's going to grow and shrink. If the form shrinks too much, you get a problem, and you've also got to make sure you put those margins on the right ones, the right elements. That's a little hard to keep track of. That's why I just do my row definition and my column definition of 20 on both the front end and the back end, just to put those kind of margins in by default, kind of bake them in. It also makes my columns and rows start at 1 instead of 0, which is kind of nice. So now I have a little bit of space here, and now I can move on to my next element I want to add, which is a button. So it's called button. And again, we're going to call it, give it x.name equals, let's call it the submit button. And we're going to give it a content that says run me. And we're going to give it a grid dot column of 1 and a grid dot row of 3. And there we have our button here. Now notice that it said content. And this is where WPF gets a little tricky sometimes, and that's why it's helpful to have this property window here, is that for a text block, it's called text. And that's what comes out on the screen. For a button, it's called content. Now the reason it's called content is because instead of putting this here, instead we could do is not make this a self-closing button, but instead have an open button tag and a closing button tag. And inside of there, put something else. And so you actually have maybe an icon and some words, or an icon, some words, and a swirling, a swirling icon as well. Whatever you want to do, we could do inside this button. But in our case, I just want to put a little bit of text content, therefore it's called content, and there is the text that goes inside of it. So that's it. So that button. Now notice my button again is tucked right up underneath first name, and it's also the size of this column and row. Now the reason it's this size is because a button will take up the available space you give it. In fact, just to demonstrate that, let's do this. Grid.column_span equals 2. And now my button is this large. Now if I said row span, it wouldn't do a whole lot because those extra rows are empty or autofill, which is going to be 0 unless you tell it to be larger. But what we've done here is you said, okay, this is the height that that row needs to be. And that's based upon the font size, run me. But when I do column span, it goes, okay, I can fill that in. And it fills in because this column is an extra 160 pixels, no problem, I'll fill that. And so if we actually spilled it over into the 1 star, we go all the way over to this edge line here. So buttons, unless you specify a height and width, just kind of get bigger or smaller depending on what space you give it. So that's just, kind of showing off what they do. You could say, do you want to change that? You could say, well, here is the maximum height, or here's the height, here's the width. But I kind of like to leave them the way they are and just do margins. And so in this case, I might just do a margin of 10, and boom, there you go. It's shrunk this down, what it's done. It shrunk it down by 10 pixels on each side because it says, okay, this is the total width you have. And I said, okay, let's take 10 pixels on each side, make it white space instead, and it kind of shrinks it down. So that's kind of nice. It centers it then, which is really fun. But we could also say, well, maybe we want to push it down a little further. And if we want to do that, we'd have to put a margin below the text block and text box. Otherwise, it'd be kind of funky looking. So the key here is WPF is very, very flexible, but you have to kind of think through what you really want to do with that flexibility. You can't just kind of throw things together. Now, again, just to come back to my soapbox a little bit, we didn't drag and drop anything on here because you want to have this flexibility of expansion and change based upon our form size. Now, right now, our form doesn't change a whole lot based upon the size because it's kind of all locked in a little bit, but we can make that a little more flexible and actually make it grow and shrink depending on our how the form is sized. But for now, we're just going to kind of leave this as a simple demo. We're not going to get into the really in-depth stuff. So that's kind of the basics of a form. We've got our header label, we've got our text box, we've got our button. Now let's actually wire this button up and do something. So I click on my button here and go to Properties. And notice in the upper right-hand corner, we have this lightning bolt, which indicates events, just like we do in WinForms. And we have the click event, so I can double click on this, and it actually creates the submit button underscore click, which is great. That's one of the reasons why I named this submit button before I created that event, because I wanted to have it say submit button underscore click instead of button underscore click. So that's kind of important. The other thing is note that it's still just XAML. So click equals submit button underscore click. So if you didn't want to go to the property window, change to events, double click the right one, you could have said click equals and then put in your event. Also note, if you want to get rid of this event, the event's now gone. Now the code's still there, but we can safely delete this code because it's not attached to anything. And that's one of the kickers of WinForm was if you deleted the code before you deleted the event, then what would happen is it would...
If you can hang on just a couple more minutes, we're almost done with this, but do you remember what he's talking about from when we did the calculator? Remember that the guy specified that you had to... Was it the calculator or was it the rock, paper, scissors?
I think it was the calculator.
I'm pretty sure what... Yeah, oh, because rock, paper, scissors was text-based, yeah. Yeah, it was the calculator that he said, now, hey, make sure if you're going to do this, do it in this order, because if you don't, it's going to freak out and not be able to find the thing you're looking for, and it's going to like screw everything up. So that is nice that you can remove it from wherever, and it's not going to throw you an error or anything like that. So, like I said, we're just about done. Just hang on with me just a few minutes more, I promise.
It would cause the WinForm to crash and be a real pain to try and get back. Whereas this is all out in the open, we can just modify it and we're good to go. So let's put that back. I'm going to do it through the XAML window instead. Say click equals, and notice it says new event handler. Just click on that. Ensure event failed. Excellent. Normally that'll work. It may have to do with the fact that I deleted before and then redid it, but let's try again. This may be Tim's wish list number 4. Yep. Tim's wish list number 4 is to fix that bug in the editor. But we go back over here, double click on an event, and we've really broken Visual Studio now. So this is one of those things where when in doubt, we're going to go ahead and restart the application and see if that doesn't solve our problem. So close out Visual Studio, and we'll open it back up in just a minute, and we'll try this again. So let's go to Open Project Solution. We're going to find ours, the APF demo. Open it back up. And now let's try this again. Click equals, now let's tab, and it fills it right in. Submit button underscore click. Come over here. There's our submit button underscore click. So if you see that bug in the editor, and that's all you need to do to fix it, is just save everything, close it down, open it back up, and then try it again. But just type click equals, and then when it comes up with that new event, just tab on it or double click on it, and it will create your code for you. So in here, we're just going to do a very, very simple message box.show, and we'll just say, $, double quotes, hello, space, and then we'll do the first name text dot text, and that's just the person's first name, whatever they typed in the box. So that's just a really simple submit button event we're going to do. So let's run this now just to show that this event works and that our text box works and that it looks all pretty. So let's say Tim run me. Hello, Tim. Excellent. So our WPF window works, and our text box works, our button works, and in fact, we can resize as he wanted to. Notice it doesn't shrink really nicely yet. That's something we can add in the future to make this actually grow or shrink depending on the window size. Right now, it acts a little more like WinForms, and so we haven't really taken advantage of a lot of the benefits of WPF quite yet. But we'll get there. But for this demo, we're going to kind of stop at that point. We're not going to go way in depth in WPF. I'll do some future videos to kind of give you a little more targeted.
Okay, so those are the basics of WPF. Now, like I said, I apologize. I fire hose you with a lot of information, and that was kind of a bit dry. I feel like he's a little more interesting than some of the people that I've shown videos from. But what we, first of all, let me ask, does anybody have any idea what our project is going to be for today? Any thought? Maybe the thing that we just watched him do? So maybe if you've been following along, yes, sir?
Maybe like a submit form or something?
No, maybe just exactly what we just saw him do. So if you were following along this whole time, you've already got most of it done. If not, I'll have a link on Canvas for the video so you can watch it at your leisure and get that all taken care of. Now, that will be due next time, and the reason is because we just watched the whole thing, and you'll be able to just follow along and do exactly what he does. Now, next time we will start doing, we'll start talking about specific aspects of WPF and of .NET Core, and so just as a preview, beginning next time after you watch a couple of videos, you're going to start porting your calculator over to the .NET Core and to WPF. That way, we can scale it up as big and small as we want. Now, hopefully, as you were watching that video, you were thinking, oh man, that grid system would be really nice for a calculator because it's already sort of set up that way. Yep, it is. So that's what we're going to be starting on next time. Now, if you would like to work as a big giant group on that project, that's fine. Everyone needs to have their own version on their own computer. But if you want to work as a group and share code and ideas and thoughts, that's absolutely fine. Okay, any questions, concerns, comments, thoughts, or ideas before I send you on break and we come back and work for about the next hour? Nope. All right, come back at, let's say 10:25 and we'll work for about an hour or so.